Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne. I won't do that to you too often in our time together. Your main program staff, which is Katie and Sarah and I, spent a few days this past week intensively planning for the coming church year and talking about the work and the ministries of this church. And one of the things that we talked about was worship, its purpose, its meaning, what it should look like. What's the order that we do things in and why? And one of the changes you may have noticed that Sarah instituted this last month is asking members of the congregation to come forward and light our chalice. Now, this slight change actually has a larger meaning behind it. It used to be that the staff lit the flame. But the flame of our faith is not kept alive by the staff of the church. It is kept alive by and burns brightly because of each of you who claim this faith tradition. You'll also notice that we move the chalice itself from the side to the center in front of the pulpit. Yes, that has symbolism too. Everything that we do, all the changes we make are for a reason. Now, come September, we will be asking households to light a smaller chalice from this one and to carry it home each week with the intent to light it each night, or for that matter, any time that works for that household. It's a symbolic way of keeping the flame of our faith burning beyond Sunday morning worship. It's also a way of saying that this flame, this chalice, this faith tradition is yours. Similar to the words we say sometimes after receiving our offering, we say, "This is my community, I have need of it, and it has need of me." The chalice flame has need of all of you. We come together on Sunday mornings because we have need of one another, and because of what it is that we can create and do in community, the things we cannot do alone. We also come here because we have needs. Many people who walk into our church, roll into our church, we may never know what brought them here, but it was probably some kind of need, because in this day and age, nobody just walks or rolls into a church. There's a reason. Some of it's spiritual, some of it may be a life crisis. And we come to church because we need to be in a place that challenges us to live into what we value. And this chalice flame, this chalice, it can hold all of that. And it has become the symbol of our faith. The Reverend Dan Hotchkiss, in his brochure called The Flaming Chalice, states that the flaming chalice combines two archetypes, a drinking vessel and a flame. And he goes on to say that flames stand watch at monuments and tombs. Candles flicker in cathedrals and temples and mosques and meeting houses. A flame can symbolize witness, sacrifice, testing, courage, and illumination. A chalice with a flame is the kind of chalice that the Greeks and Romans put on their altars. The holy oil burning in it is a symbol of helpfulness and sacrifice. This chalice, the chalice, became the symbol of Unitarianism during World War II, when what was then the Unitarian Service Committee was engaged in the work of aiding refugees all across Europe. And they needed something that made them legitimate, or appeared to be legitimate in the eyes of the authorities that they were dealing with. They needed a symbol for their letterhead and for their badges and for all those papers that are tied up with making a bureaucracy legitimate. And the man who would design this symbol was himself a refugee from the Nazis. He had drawn one too many political cartoons that made him flee his homeland. And he had never attended a Unitarian worship service, but he had come in contact with Unitarianism through its work with refugees. And so he wrote a letter to the Reverend Charles Joy, who was then the head of the service committee, because Joy had asked Deutsch to create a symbol for our organization. And this is what he said: "There is something that urges me to tell you how much I admire your utter self-denial and readiness to serve, to sacrifice all, your time, your health, your well-being, to help, help, help. I am not what you actually call a believer, but if your kind of life is the profession of your faith, as it is, I feel sure, then religion, ceasing to be magic and mysticism, becomes confessional to practical philosophy, and what is more, to active, really useful social work." Reverend Hotchkiss writes that the symbol of the flaming chalice stood in the beginning for a life of service. When Deutsch designed the flaming chalice, he had seen faith in action. People who were willing to risk all for others in a time of urgent need. So the symbol of our faith, this chalice, represents a faith in and of action, as well as a metaphorical drinking vessel. It quenches not only our thirst for justice, but our spiritual thirst. Our thirst to live out and into our values. And it holds the pluralism of our beliefs. So I hope that each household over the years will take a chalice home and keep its flame alive, and that you will be fed by the flame, sustained by it, nurtured by it. Let it be lit as a prayer every time there is a tear in the fabric of life. Let it keep watch with you as it has kept watch at those monuments and tombs, and in cathedrals, and in temples, and in mosques, and meeting houses for hundreds and hundreds of years. Unitarianism, Universalism, and Unitarian Universalism in this country have never been passive, insular religious traditions. Way before the chalice became the symbol of our faith, our religious ancestors were busy following their faith out of church buildings into the town square, quite literally the town square in New England. They were, in those early years of the 1800s, following the radical teachings of Jesus, whose life basically consisted of love, teaching, healing, prayer, and love, 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 and now repeat. That's it. A love that chose the poor and the marginalized, that challenged the cultural structures and systems that created the poor and marginalized, that was greater than human fear. If you take the life and work of Jesus seriously, you will not be capable of having a passive faith. In fact, things are going to get a whole lot more complicated. A whole lot more complicated, because you're going to have to take on all the inequities of the world. You're going to have to work to end human and species and planetary suffering, not from a place of righteous anger, which ends up with that hula hoop of burnout, but from a place of love, that love that is beyond belief and that is greater than fear. So many of us who are Unitarian Universalists today, we're not necessarily following the mandates of Jesus, as our religious ancestors did. Instead, we gather, as do many in liberal religious traditions, around values and ideals and ideas. The values are those things which determine what is important in life. We also gather around shared morals, which are no more than standards of behavior or beliefs concerning what is and what is not acceptable for a person to do. We come together around 7 principles. All of these govern our actions in the world, our ethics. Now here's the thing. Many folks in the 20th and the 21st centuries have found themselves attracted to UUism because of its justice work, because you all have always been at the protests, at the rallies, at the marches, in the streets, making the phone calls, holding up the signs. But we should not confuse faith and action with a political action committee. Justice work is a part of our religious life, but it cannot substitute for it, says the Reverend Deborah Holder. And Deborah came into ministry from a background of community organizing and social work. And she watched as those who were engaged in social justice work in our churches get further and further marginalized, as they got further and further demoralized, as they became burned out. And she made this astute observation. Unitarian Universalism is not a political action faith community. We are a faith community that inspires us to live out and act upon our values and faith in the world. Unitarian Universalism has paid inadequate attention to faith development, in particular regard to justice. In an effort to be a relevant faith tradition, we have allowed politics to replace spiritual depth. Let me say that again. We have allowed politics to replace spiritual depth. Those in search of a spiritual home, a transformational community designed to help us grow into the kinds of human beings we really want to be, often leave our churches. So Deborah asks that we all remember that we are members of a progressive church, and that the purpose of a progressive church is to, quote, increase our capacity for love of the self, for love of something larger than ourselves, and for the love of neighbor. She asks us to claim a religious vision of ourselves building beloved community right here and right now. That we envision and be engaged in the process of, quote, transformation, liberation, connection, empowerment, quoting a very old piece from one of our ancestors, that service itself be our prayer. For us to insist that we too have a saving story, a story of cooperation rather than domination, that we affirm the one doctrine that we do have, covenant, and use it to build beloved community, that we proclaim that each one of us is loved beyond belief, and that no one is left behind. So the Reverend Pamela Watt, who serves a congregation in Denton, Texas, puts it this way: more important than whether activism is a measure of our faith is whether our faith prepares and strengthens people to campaign for justice in small and big ways. While on retreat, I asked Katie and Sarah to describe their experience of a worship service that was particularly impactful or powerful for them. And I shared one of mine that I'm going to share with you. It happened when I was in seminary. And the seminary that I attended was about 50 miles from Groton, Connecticut. Do any of you know what's in Groton, Connecticut? A naval submarine base where they build nuclear submarines. And then they come all the way around, and someplace, I think it was Bremerton, they got loaded with the actual nuclear banger. Thank you. So what happened was that some of my students, the students in the community, decided they were going to trespass onto the base to pray in protest. And we all knew that they would be arrested for their witness. So there was a service held in the chapel of the seminary. I remember my mentor preaching and talking about our profession as clergy and about our profession of faith. I remember that we shared communion in the round, and that we basically commissioned those who were going to Groton to live their faith in the public square on behalf of all of us. I'll never forget that experience of worship. that wove together our profession of faith and the action it required of us. Activism, working for social change, working to end suffering and exploitation, working to disrupt business and busyness as usual in the presence of the climate emergency we are living in, working to release children and youth from detention centers at our borders. All that work tearing down walls is exhausting, and it's soul and spirit depleting. And burnout is common, but even more so is anger and despair. And that is a spiritual issue. It was here in 1981 that I heard from a doctoral student at the U of O that the folks that could go the distance in justice work were those who were grounded in a faith tradition. Dr. Takiya Amin, the content director for Black Lives Matter UU, says, "This faith requires something of us in return for being our ideological home, and that requires that we get up, get out, and build the world we dream about." But she also goes on to say that the way that I have experienced most UUs talk about and live out any kind of activism commitment is separate from any deep, rigorous, or thoughtful engagement with the philosophical and theological underpinnings of our faith. It is superficial, unreflective, and inauthentic. This leaves us with a tepid, watered-down social justice agenda and culture that is separate from a thoughtful articulation of Unitarian Universalism as a faith identity and religious spiritual path. She goes on to say that I think one of the most effective ways of putting faith into action is first to get really clear about your faith. What do you actually believe? When is the last time you engaged any of the sources of our faith meaningfully to refine and clarify your own principle and direction? I cannot stress her words enough. Each of us needs to get clear, to articulate our own beliefs about what is of ultimate meaning and importance, and at least read our principles and sources. They're in the front of the hymnal if you haven't noticed, and if you're getting a little bored, you can just read those. You know, at our retreat, Katie and Sarah and I had a discussion about what was then the upcoming God, Guns, and Trump rally. The question was, for all of us, what is right action as people of faith in response to the event? Do we, as many have suggested, ignore it so that it not receive any more attention than it should? Or do we actively resist it by being present and witnessing our faith? And Sarah had gotten confirmation that this rally was actually organized by neo-Nazis, despite the way it was being advertised. We know for a fact that it was organized by neo-Nazis. In the end, we decided that Sarah would attend the rally in her clerical collar, and that I would go to Pride. Early yesterday morning, I texted Sarah this message: "Thank you for embodying our faith and witness today. Ground yourself deeply in your faith. Peace be with you." Later in the day, we checked in. Sarah's presence in her collar was appreciated by many who were present. And being the former bartender that she is, Sarah says that she physically broke up at least a dozen fights. Now, those of you who were at Pride saw those folks who were carrying signs that were filled with hatred for those who happened to be queer. And I would happen to be standing with the Methodist minister who was wearing his collar. I was wearing our wonderful shirts. Where's Ryan? Ryan, would you like to just stand up for a moment, please, and model our beautiful shirts that you designed and got for us? And is it true, Ryan, that for those of us who did not order our shirts, we are doing a second order? That is true? Should people see you afterwards? Or Lizzie, thank you, Lizzie. Those two, please get those. They're beautiful shirts. They're comfortable shirts. I'll stop talking about them. I wish I had worn my clerical collar, though, so that I could have stood in front of those people who profess to be people of faith and who were instead full of hatred that was harmful to people who were there, that I could have stood there with my collar quietly with the sign that said, "Love is greater than fear." A church doing justice differs from the way other organizations or institutions do justice work because we're grounded, we're framed, and we're motivated by something else in what guides us to do this work, in what we return to when we are threatened or discouraged by what we encounter, often violence. And if we want to go to the distance, then we've got to have a firm footing to live out not just our moral and intellectual reasoning, but we need a spirituality. And let me tell you, spirituality is not limited to people who profess to be Christian or Muslim or Jewish. I'm telling you, there is a spirituality in humanism that I would encourage people to investigate and claim. If we don't have this, we're going to buckle under the persistent battering ram of injustice and lovelessness of all the forces that combine to strip all that lives of value and worth. We have to attend to our own souls. Each soul must find its solace. We need to become intimately acquainted with the place that sustains and nurtures our souls so that when the acid weariness rains down upon us, it will not take hold and blight us. We have to find a way to let the chalice light in. The new president of your board of trustees of this church, Daniel Blades, has said that our human task and our task as a church is to, quote, create heaven on earth. And yes, I did ask his permission to quote him. I believe that Daniel's heaven is synonymous with what Deborah talks about as the beloved community. Heaven's not something that's relegated to an afterlife only attainable after death. It breaks into our present, and it lives here and now on earth whenever love triumphs, whenever justice prevails. It is, as the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Parker says, striving for what is not yet, but could be. And Gustav Gutierrez, who's one of the founders of liberation theology, says that beloved community is another word for salvation. And friends, if you're having a hard time with that word, I'm going to challenge you, because I think there is an awful lot we need to be saved from. We need to be saved from violence, exploitation, degradation, poverty, greed, militarism, fascism, totalitarianism, abuse, addiction, corruption. You can fill in all the blanks. What was so egregious that I left out? Fill it in silently then. And the interfaith minister, Reverend Shirley Strong, this is how she describes beloved community. It's an inclusive, interrelated society based on love, justice, compassion, responsibility, shared power and respect for all people, places, and things, a society that radically transforms individuals and restructures institutions. I'd like to think that church is the place we get to practice this vision, to make our way, however imperfectly, into the beloved community. The Reverend John Perkins, who is a Black Christian minister and author of the book, The Authentic Church, says that an authentic church is recognizable by its ability to absorb pain, its ability to proclaim hope in a despairing world, and that the church lives out its call most fully when it is a community of faith with its arms around a community of pain. I believe that that's what Sarah was trying to do yesterday, and I believe those of you who were at Pride were offering that to so many of us. This is what it means to be the beloved community, to create heaven on earth. And the only way we're going to be able to do it, my friends, is if we are grounded and sustained by religious and spiritual practices. If we trade off offering one another hope, when we trade off offering one another sustenance, when we trade off blessing one another's lives, when we take turns keeping the chalice flame lit, it's all part of ushering in the beloved community, which is here and now, which is ours to create. Each Sunday, the church sends us forth, grounded in love, to love the hell out of the world. And it welcomes us back each week. It receives us. It throws its arms around us in that same love, the love that restores and renews and reignites our passion for justice. Church reminds us not only of who we are, but of whose we are. We are a people of heaven on earth, a beloved community. We are chalice lighters and chalice keepers. As Deborah Holder says, beloved community is our UU inheritance and our great commission. A passage in the Talmud, which is the commentary on Hebrew scriptures, kind of sums it up. It says, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. Go forth to love the hell out of the world, to do the work, and to be sustained by this beloved community. And may it be so. So be it. Amen."